Greetings, Cougars. Professor Pachel here, and I'm going to take you through sort of a rhetorical analysis of Brent Staples' Just Walk On By, Black Men in Public Space, which is our reading for this week. First of all, I want to start with the title, Just Walk On By. That's from a classic soul song by Dionne Warwick, and the sentiment is, just keep walking, right? And that comes out in the essay pretty strongly. The second part, the subtitle is Black Men in Public Space. Okay, and that's what this essay is going to be about. It's a first-hand experience from Brent Staples, the narrator and writer, but it's also sort of a specific case that shows a general problem. Okay, and the problem is the way that Black men are perceived in public often, especially at night. All right. So he starts off, his introduction is really an attention getter. It sounds very ominous and scary. He talks about his first victim. It's a young white woman, well dressed in her early 20s. And he's walking behind her, and maybe as the readers were thinking, oh no, this is going to be a mugging or something like that. And she starts walking faster and eventually starts running away when she sees him. And he describes himself. He does a contrast between them. He's a tall black man, 6'2", broad-shouldered. He's got a big afro. It sounds like a beard. He's wearing a military jacket. So he does say, possibly if you met somebody like this at night, he's setting up the idea that it could be sort of scary. Okay, so she runs away. Now he gives some background. In paragraph 2, he goes into his background, goes back a decade. He says that was a decade ago, so he's writing this as an older person. He was a grad student at the University of Chicago when that happened, so he was not some thug or mugger out on the street like she probably thought that he was, right? And uh, he has this realization, and I think this is very interesting, that he can alter public space in ugly ways. That means change public space. He can actually change it just by his presence. And if you think about that, it's kind of a strange idea, but he walks by people at night or behind people at night, and people become frightened and scared, and they have all sorts of reactions from running away, to speeding up their pace, to going down a cross street, whatever it is. And this is a realization that he had. Okay, he says the white woman probably thought he was a mugger or a rapist or worse. I don't know what's worse than that. Maybe a murderer or something. But he says that he is being perceived as being perceived as dangerous is a hazard in itself. Okay, so it's almost like, okay, they're thinking that he's dangerous, the people that he encounters, but it's really kind of a danger for him too when this goes on. And he says there's a vast unnerving gulf lay between nighttime pedestrians, right? And there's always the possibility of death in these situations. And he's referring to himself. Okay. He goes into in paragraph 3, he goes into some analysis and examples. He says that he was thoroughly familiar with the language of fear. And he recounts an example of when he was walking in front of a car in a crosswalk at night, and he heard the thunk, 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 thunk of all the locks going down. Somebody hit the button to lock the car when they saw him. And he even says, black, white, male, female, gets a typical reaction like this. Okay, so he says that people cross the street on the other side when they see him coming rather than pass him. And he refers to these as standard. Oh, and then he talks about what he calls standard unpleasantries, dealing with police, doormen, cab drivers, and they always sort of regard him with suspicion. Okay, and remember, he's this large black man. Uh, then we have a transition. He moves to New York in his life, but also that's where the essay goes. And he says that, when it's in a big crowd, it's not a problem. But if he's walking in Soho, late at night, the streets are narrow, the sidewalks are narrow, things can get very taut, right? So that means tense. Um, he goes into paragraph 4. He's in Brooklyn now. This is where he lives, and he often encounters women who fear the worst. He does sort of offer us an alternative viewpoint, right? He says that women are often vulnerable to street violence and that black men are overrepresented perpetrators of that violence. So he sort of understands, but it doesn't help him, it doesn't give him comfort from the alienation he feels from always being the suspect, okay, his perceived identity. And that's what this essay largely is about perceptions. You see somebody and you think, oh, this guy's a professional, or this guy's a mugger, or this guy's scary, right? We humans tend to make judgments based on appearances, and that's what this whole essay is about, particularly about black men when they're out in public. He does go into some in his background. He talks about growing up in a pretty rough neighborhood with a lot of violence, gang warfare, street knifings, he says. But he was in maybe half a dozen fistfights, and he grew up as one of the good boys. And he says that he's sort of timid and combat shy, meaning. And earlier in the essay, he talks about how he's a softie. He says he can hardly cut up raw chicken, let alone put a knife to somebody's throat. Okay? So after the background, we get more background in paragraph 6. He says that in his youth, he saw lots of tough guys locked up and killed, and that he sort of just stayed away from that whole thing. Even his brother was killed when he was 22 years old. So he's no stranger to this kind of street violence, but he says that as he said earlier, that he's a good boy. He grew up a good boy. He was shy and timid, and he just kind of avoided those sorts of situations. And in paragraph 7, he kind of goes more into the fearsomeness in public places. And he gives us more examples. So he does a lot of example and description in this essay. And his first example is an incident when he was bringing uh, a finished piece of writing to his editor, and he came into the building, and somebody called security, and the building manager and security were after him, and they chased him all the way to his editor's door. And only because people knew him there, he got out of that situation. Also, he talks about a time that he went into a jewelry store. He was working on another story, waiting to interview somebody. And he went into this jewelry store to kill time. And the woman in the jewelry store disappeared and then comes back with a Doberman pinscher straining at the end of its leash. So these are all examples of how he is perceived in society, mostly by white people, but in general, people in general as well. And he says that he knew another black journalist who was covering a story about a murderer. And when this journalist went to the scene, he was sitting in his car and he was mistaken for the murderer, pulled out at gunpoint, and only saved by his press, his newspaper credentials from the police that took him. Right. And he says that he has had to smother the rage at being perceived as a criminal. And could you imagine this if you were walking around every day and people thought this guy is a burglar, a murderer, a rapist, right? That perception comes to mind very quickly and naturally. So in paragraph 10, he talks about some of his solutions to the problem. He says that when he's in public, he moves about with care. He gives people a wide berth on the subway platform. This is, if he's waiting for a subway and there's a bunch of people around, he stands apart from them. He lets people walk ahead of him in building lobbies so they don't think he's following them. He just kind of hangs out and lets them clear out. And he's always calm and congenial when pulled over by the police. And these are strategies that he has to do not for other people, but to keep himself safe. He goes, paragraph 11, he goes into his conclusion, and here we go. He returns to the ideas of his introduction, back to those night walks. Okay, and what does he do on the night walks? He whistles classical tunes. Okay, so he whistles Vivaldi, or Beethoven, and he says that New Yorkers seem to mellow out when they hear classical music because they don't think that a mugger or some sort of criminal would be whistling classical tunes. Okay, and um, he ends with a very striking metaphor or an analogy. He says that uh, these classical tunes are sort of like the cowbell that hikers wear when they're in bear country. Now, this is an interesting metaphor for a couple of reasons. One of them is that uh, it hikers wear that so that bears hear them coming and don't bother them. Right? The cowbell, ding, 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 and he says that's what his whistling classical tunes is like. But who's in danger in that situation? It's the hiker wearing the cowbell, right? We think that the other people, like the bears, probably even, and the people around him, this is his comparison, right? Uh, they think they're in danger, but in reality, it's the hiker who's in danger. It's the black man who's in danger. Just to let you know that Brent Staples, you obviously know that during all this time, he was a graduate student, he was a reporter, he was a journalist, he's got a PhD in psychology. So he is an educated, upstanding member of society who's judged just by the way he looks. So Staples uses very good form in this, right? He uses lots of examples, very specific. He uses background. He considers the other side, like, yes, women do get a lot of street violence, and black men are overrepresented in perpetrating that street violence. He goes through all of these things to make his point that in many of these cases, it's the black man who is in danger. Okay, well, I'll see you next time. Fair forward, Cougars.